You may have heard the term Jungle Carbine, but what does it really mean? Does it refer to the small, light, handy Lee Enfield No. 5 Mark I? Or was it a marketing term invented by an opportunistic military surplus importer who wanted to maximize profit? It will come as no surprise that the answer is a dash of the first and a heaping helping of the second. Scott Owens here with Mimosa Research. On this channel, we focus on military and modern small arms from the collector's perspective. Stick around and I'll arm you with information so that you don't get screwed. Today, I have two examples from the Lee Enfield family to examine. The first example is a genuine Rifle No. 5 Mark I Jungle Carbine, and in conjunction with that, I have an example of the Santa Fe Mountaineer from the Golden State Arms Company out of Pasadena, California, circa 1965. I'll have a ton of links to my sources down below in the comments. These video projects take hours and hours to research. If I make a material mistake, please help me out by commenting below, and I will certainly pin a comment with any and all well-sourced corrections. And I also want to highlight the sponsor of today's video, ArdioZen. I'll go into a little more detail later in the video, but Henry over at ArdioZen is an expert on all things Lee Enfield and can help you find that missing or obscure part for your Commonwealth firearm. Without his help, I would not have been able to make this video today. Check him out over at ardiozen.com. The Rifle No. 5 Mark I is known as the shortest serving rifle for the British Armed Forces. It was designed near the end of World War II with a focus on weight savings over the heavy Rifle No. 4. Despite being known for assisting British Army soldiers as they ramped up conflicts in warmer, more humid areas, its first documented use was actually in Holland and Norway towards the end of World War II. Santa Fe, on the other hand, was a division of a large post-war importer-exporter, the previously mentioned Golden State Arms. The Santa Fe division specifically focused on exploiting gaps in the gigantic surplus arms market. They took extremely low-cost surplus arms and modified them to fit market demands. It could be said they helped to create demand by using clever marketing to make lemons and lemonade, turning excess capacity of surplus arms into products that met fashionable trends of the day. Got a bunch of ratty SMLEs in any configuration in any condition? No problem, cut them up and turn them into Jungle Carbines. In fact, an argument could be made that the reason we know the No. 5 Mark I as the Jungle Carbine today is due to this marketing. The Mountaineer is another one of their brainchilds. Over time, as the sporterization craze took hold, Santa Fe created several product grades that varied in features, part quality, and donor rifle condition. The Mountaineer was a mid-market grade with all new furniture and donor rifle parts that received some degree of polishing to beautify the rough appearance of a service rifle. Of course, it didn't hurt that both the brand name of Santa Fe and the product name Mountaineer evoked another craze at the time: all things Western. Genius! Today, due in large part to this sporterization trend of the post-war period, survivor military surplus in original condition is highly valued. So let's start off our series with a quick and dirty how to spot a Santa Fe. Then we will look for the good, the bad, and the ugly on this surviving No. 5 Mark I. Finally, we'll look more closely at this Mountaineer to discuss the modifications made, and I'll speak to why it's priceless to me. And I invite you to stick around to the end to hear a brief story about the Santa Fe brand and Golden State Arms specifically. Due to the practice of cutting up existing surplus and creating jungle carbines, the term Santa Fe has become a dirty word in the modern Lee Enfield collector community. Sellers who were either ignorant or unscrupulous have been passing off Santa Fe jungle carbines as originals since the 60s. During that same time period, it was not nearly as common as it is today to find original configuration No. 5 Mark I rifles. When you did find them, they brought a premium, so there was incentive to turn a blind eye to originality and rake in extra money. Today, importers have brought to market many previously unknown stashes of original configuration No. 5 Mark Is. These recent imports will be wearing import stamps and are often in fairly poor condition, having been rotting away in less than ideal conditions for many decades. While it's not as uncommon to find original configuration No. 5 Mark Is as it once was, it would be helpful to learn the attributes to look for to identify a real No. 5 Mark I. Originally, I wanted to say that Santa Fe didn't necessarily intend to deceive buyers back in the day. However, after quite a bit of research, I think they were certainly walking the thinnest of razor-thin lines with their advertising. Their products were clearly marked as Santa Fe, and they are largely credited with popularizing the term Jungle Carbine. True, many buyers in the period didn't have access to the amount of information we have, and their sole sources of this info would have been the firearm periodicals of their day, such as Guns and Ammo, Guns, and American Rifleman. As a result, they may have seen an ad from Santa Fe, and little in the ad would prevent them from drawing an erroneous conclusion. I do know that with the separation of several decades, confusion exists to this day over these matters, even though it's easier than ever to get the correct info. Back to the features of a genuine No. 5 Mark I. Similar to how our Garands or carbines or M1911s were made by different companies during wartime, the Crown had a similar process of farming out contracts to different organizations. In the case of the rifle No. 5 Mark I, those two organizations were the Royal Ordnance Factory Fizzackerley, or ROFF, and Birmingham Small Arms, BSA. Some features are dependent on the manufacturer, but most of the features are largely the same. Since the example I have here is a Fizzackerley, and yes, I had a YouTube native saying it, this treatise will primarily focus on that maker. I will note there are many things that go into a comprehensive evaluation. As one can imagine, there are literal books written on the subject. Books are available on everything from stampings on the metal parts, cartouches on stocks, to variations in configuration by the serious Enfield collector community. So this will be more of a make sure it's not a Santa Fe type of eval, not a deep dive into all the factory stampings used during production. I'm going to focus on three aspects the collector can use to quickly separate obvious copies from a factory build. We will apply those lessons to this example. The three attributes in descending order of importance are lightning cuts, stocks, and markings. Let's start off with the lightning cuts. In order to produce a rifle that weighed less than previous configurations, engineers undertook aggressive measures to cut weight, seemingly to the extreme. Santa Fe might have taken similar efforts, but since they operated a small machine shop or sometimes utilized a series of contractors, also likely small machine shops, they weren't as focused on some of the more difficult operations. The number one operation that Santa Fe skipped was lightening the barrel at the chamber end. It was simple to lop nearly 5.5 inches off the typical barrel to get a length of 18 3/4 inches, but it was far more difficult to make the scalloped cuts seen here. And again, I'm using my tactical Sharpie, which has a carbon fiber core, so don't panic as I point with this. Especially since this area of the barrel was buried under a handguard and would rarely see the light of day. Having scalloped cuts on the barrel was never done at Santa Fe, so if you see scalloped cuts here, it's a huge indicator that you are on a good path. However, that very factor works against the collector. Few sellers are going to tolerate removing the handguard for eval. So let's look at a couple of other areas where Santa Fe economized the process that are more visible. On the receiver, government engineers carefully considered where features could be removed and where weight could be cut without impacting reliability or accuracy. Look, I'm not going to get into the whole wandering zero dispute. Feel free to Google that shit if you're interested in going down a rabbit hole. I'll link to a comprehensive forum post that documents all the factory lightning cuts performed on No. 5 Mark Is. All credit to the collector community that has documented those over the years. Santa Fe, however, took more of a fuck it approach. So-called Jungle Carbines seem to be made out of any available receiver style that crossed their warehouse. The features of the eventual Santa Fe Jungle Carbine depended on what model they started with. Most of the ones I have seen have been made from two variations, either the SMLE No. 1 Mark III Star or the Rifle No. 4 Mark I Mark IIs. While I'll avoid the confusing numbering scheme applied to the Lee Enfield style rifles over the years, what you need to know for the purposes of this discussion is that the Mark III Stars were easier to pick out. They had a flying charger bridge and a tangent sight. They also had very heavy rear sight protector wings, which required a notch at the top of the forend. This notch will become important in a bit. The Rifle No. 4 is tougher to pick out at a glance. Another obvious and externally visible area where Santa Fe simply didn't bother was the trigger guard. Genuine No. 5 Mark I trigger guards will have a scallop at the edge of the trigger guard as seen here, identified as the lines near the top of the trigger loop. It would be unusual for Santa Fe to exhibit these cuts, but not impossible, as they could have sourced via random luck of the draw a real number 5 Mark I trigger guard. Again, there are many other finer details we could get into, but these are some standout areas to look for, even though one is hidden behind the handguard. I do want to show these trigger guards in a little bit more detail here. And so you can see this is a genuine number 5 Mark I trigger guard, and you can see those lines where the trigger guard itself was actually thinned. And so you can see, I'll grab my tactical Sharpie here, that shelf as well as the trigger guard itself is thinned across here, or rather machined across this way, in order to thin out this entire section of the trigger guard. You wouldn't think it makes that much of a difference. They were looking for literally every ounce they could. Now, if I compare that to a trigger guard off of a Santa Fe, you can see this is a trigger guard that you would find on anything up to the number 5 Mark I, where there was no thinning. Additionally, you can see on this trigger guard, as I had mentioned before, there was a bit of an attempt to polish, to beautify certain parts of the rifle on the Santa Fe, and it just depended on the make and model. Going to the back, we can see this is fairly well polished across here, even though it's picked up some chatter marks over the years. But you can see the real difference when we hold these two side by side. And I can tell you, just holding these two, like this is, you can feel the weight difference. You wouldn't think you'd be able to, but you certainly can. Now, one other area to focus on. So this is the number 5 Mark I. This is the Santa Fe trigger guard, which is really just a, this one probably came from a number 4 Mark I or II. And you can see the difference in the scallops here, whereas this is straight. And again, this is more polished coming from Santa Fe. This is not. This is covered with the finish type that we will talk about a little bit later in the video. Now let's turn our attention to the stocks. The stock of many of these Santa Fe built Jungle Carbines based upon the Mark III stars might just be the single easiest visual way to discount it from a factory number 5 Mark I, due to the distinctive 4 windows cut into the top of the lower forend along the barrel. Due to the protective wings of the Mark IIIs, Santa Fe needed to disguise the notch cut for those wings. Solution? Cut 3 more notches and act like it was a feature, not a bug. If you see these windows, you are certainly looking at a Santa Fe created stock. One other quick telltale is a mismatched wooden plug on some of the examples I have seen. Here, Santa Fe is covering up a feature from a completely different model, a brass unit identification disc as seen on this number 1 Mark III example. The final quick attribute to tell a Santa Fe Jungle Carbine is the presence or lack of certain markings. The Santa Fe will generally be marked on the barrel with a deep stamp or roll mark that will say outright Santa Fe Jungle Carbine on one line. A factory number 5 Mark I never officially carried that moniker, so it would never be marked as such. Serial number and model markings of a factory number 5 Mark I are generally electro-penciled on, as can be seen in this example. This is true for both Fazakkerly and BSA examples. Certain other marks are stamped on, especially at the visible part of the barrel above the lower forend and before the handguard. And let me transition over to take a look at some of those markings. And you can see them here. These marks are actually marks that were created when the rifle itself was sent into civilian service and coming out of military service. You did not see these on a military service rifle or a rifle that was still in military service. And so you may not see these in some of the certain import marked versions that you will see these days. So I'll put an inset shot of what that looks like. Additionally, many metal BSA made parts do have the M47/C stamped on them, as opposed to Fazakkerly parts, which are generally missing any specific stamps, or they might have a small F. Serial numbers for Santa Fe are generally stamped and are carried over from the original receiver because often the part of the receiver that carried the original serial number has been milled off. In some cases, Santa Fe didn't even bother removing markings from the donor receiver socket, so you can sometimes see remnants of the other model mark numbers on the socket itself. Serial ranges for the number 5 Mark I generally follow either a 1 or 2 letter prefix followed by a 4-digit number. Very early examples had just 3 or 4-digit numbers, and later examples had 2-letter prefixes. Okay, so with that super quick guide, the collector can hopefully identify a Santa Fe Jungle Carbine at a glance. Remember, lightning cuts, stocks, and markings. With that out of the way, let's dig into this specific number 5 Mark I with an eye towards other areas of collector interest. We've already established a lot of the good on this particular example. We know it has the correct lightning cuts, the correct stocks, the correct configuration, and the correct electro pencil serial. But let's look at some other attributes that would fall into the good category. Let's continue our discussion on the serial number. It turns out genuine number 5s are marked with a serial in 4 or sometimes 5 other places. The rear of the bolt handle, you can see the Victor 4850 there. The barrel near the chamber, I'll throw a little B-roll on here of when I had the forend removed. The bottom of the forend, and up here you can see Victor 4850 on the bottom of the handguard. The bottom of the magazine, again you can see Victor 4850 there. And sometimes, but not often, the bottom of the trigger guard. A gigantic plus for this example is we have matching serial numbers everywhere we would expect to find them, even on the magazine. No serial on this trigger guard, but again, it wasn't often seen there. Another area that might not immediately seem good, but actually is for this example, is the finish. The black coating seen here is known as suncorite. It was basically the Cerakote of its day, in that it was a paint-like product applied to enhance corrosion resistance, and these days is known as bonderite. Nearly every surface has this coating applied, with the exception of the front of the barrel, which is primarily parkerized. From the reference pictures I have seen, it's not uncommon to find the front left in park, and the rear under the handguard to show signs of the suncorite. So this finish appears not only to be original, but in excellent condition. One other good attribute is the hollowed out bolt handle that you will see here. Lastly, the stock, the forend, and the handguard all carry many original cartouches. Included are F for Fizzackerly, mini crown number combos, as we can see here, and then even an L on here, which is noted for length of pull or long length of pull. There were 3 length of pulls noted: L marked, which is a ½ inch longer, unmarked as the standard length, and S marked, which was a ½ inch shorter. Even back then, there was an effort made to fit the tool to the user. Now, let's move on to the bad. I inherited both of these rifles from my grandfather via a treasured aunt who passed away a few years ago. One of the first things that I noticed after picking up the rifle was an aftermarket peep sight by Redfield. My heart sank a little as it looked like the installation of the peep sight involved drilling and tapping some screws for an adapter plate. Before I walked out the door, my other aunt informed me that there was an additional box of stuff that went with these firearms. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but as I got home and started to sort out that extra box, I found this. My curiosity was piqued due to the Redfield branding, but the sticker on the outside seemed to indicate Winchester, so I wasn't too excited. Until I opened it and found instructions for mounting a no-drill adapter plate. Redemption! Even better, in the envelope for the adapter plate was the original rear sight, along with the mounting hardware and the original sight plunger. Final piece of gold, the original receipt, which showed that my grandfather purchased this in September of 1966, well before the Gun Control Act of 1968. The original rear sight is a large aperture, milled steel version that goes out to the correct 800 yards. Notice the F for Fizzackerly and the broad arrow engraved on it. The only problem with it is the adjustment knob is missing, which is probably why the rear sight was replaced with a peep sight in the first place. So, not as bad as I originally thought, but I can't really put this in the good category. And here's where our sponsor, AudioZen, came to the rescue. I actually found him via eBay, and I reached out to him because he had items similar to what I was looking for, but not exactly the item I needed listed. He was super helpful in identifying the actual parts that I needed, and he made sure that his eBay listing was updated with the choice I needed to get the correct parts. He shipped quickly, and overall, it was a great experience. A few days later, I found out that he was in one of the Lee Enfield Facebook groups I was in, so I reached out and we had a great conversation. It was clear he had deep domain knowledge and a passion for Lee Enfield rifles. Because of this, I asked him to proofread this script and offer input. In our ensuing conversations, he offered to sponsor this video. What a great guy. I asked that you support this small business who is intent on passing along his knowledge and passion for the collector community. With AudioZen's help, I got the parts I needed to restore my milled sight back to as-issued condition. So don't let a couple of missing parts dissuade you from picking up one in less than complete condition. One other attribute to discuss, and I struggled with whether this should be an ugly, but eventually decided to leave it here in bad. Someone at some point added quick-release sting sleds in 2 places along the rear stock. I decided if I really wanted to, the holes could be patched and the parts replaced with relatively little effort, so I left it as bad. Now, unfortunately, we got to talk about the ugly. This is not right. What I expect to see here is a one-piece front sight flash hider bayonet lug. Instead, I get this: no bayonet lug, 2 pieces, flash hider drilled with a set screw. I haven't removed that set screw to see if it's tapped or just hanging out at the end of the barrel, waiting to yeet itself into the wild blue yonder at the least opportune time. The front sight does appear to have pins, which is okay, I guess. But I wonder what exactly went on here. What series of decisions or part breakages led to this? The separate flash hider is coated in sun chlorite, so in my imagination, it's an original, if not the original. If the bayonet lug was simply missing from a proper one-piece flash hider front sight, I could at least have justified it as a Malaysian emergency unit, well known for having ground off the bayonet lugs due to import restrictions in that country. But as it is, no idea. If you're more of an SMLE expert and seen this before, I'd love to hear from you. Now, subsequently, I did speak with Henry over at AudioZen. His theory is that something happened, somebody removed the front sight, ground it off for whatever reason. Perhaps this could have been smashed or broken or who knows what, or somebody tried to sporterize this particular front sight. We can see that there is a copper bead laid upon or laid up in the front sight post. And so who knows for sure what really happened. He thinks that maybe it was that, and then they added an aftermarket flash hider. So that's the theory. Nevertheless, once again, AudioZen to the rescue. He was able to find a reproduction, not an original. Originals are gone these days. But he did find for me a reproduction full one-piece flash hider front sight bayonet lug combo. It is Parkerized, so I am going to have to find somebody who can sun chlorite this or bonderite it, which may be very difficult these days. By the way, it did come with the pins. It came with another front sight here. So complete package ready to go from AudioZen. I think he might have just a few of these left. So if this is something you're looking for, contact him sooner rather than later. Okay, so that's the Jungle Carbine. Let's take a closer look at the Santa Fe Mountaineer. The Santa Fe division of Golden State Arms evidently made many different models of sporterized SMLEs, and one of those models was known as the Mountaineer. This time, since aftermarket sights were being installed along the tang of this shiny new barrel, the entire top got milled off, charge bridge and all. Santa Fe referred to this operation as streamlining. Bolts were sourced from God knows where and left in the white. Since the receiver underwent pretty significant surgery and the electro-pencil factory markings were probably gone, the receiver was hand-stamped with presumably the original serial. The barrel was reprofiled, roll marked with model and name, and then polished. Since the target market here were sportsmen, new 5-round magazines were sourced, again branded with the Santa Fe moniker. I happen to have 2 magazines, both exhibiting the brand name and made in Japan during a time when Japan was the Asian company making cheap trinkets, similar to how we view China today. These magazines do not have a stellar reputation, so having a couple examples on hand is wise. The stock was new wood, sans handguard. The profile of the rear stock was modern for its day, with more of a grip instead of simply a suggestion of one. The butt plate was hard rubber. The Mountaineer appeared to fill an upper middle end of the range of options and came later in the life of Santa Fe. For example, this reprint of a 1963 Golden State Arms catalog doesn't have Mountaineer listed, but it does show an Imperial Forester model that is close in features and appearance. So as you may have noticed as I was describing the Mountaineer, some of the differences with this particular one. First off, let's discuss this really interesting scope mount. This Mykrom scope mount is removable and has a great return to zero function that probably works pretty well. Let me demonstrate that for you right quick. I'm going to throw in some B-roll of me actually removing this. I am finding a few things on eBay about them, but aside from a couple of old print ads and some new old stock sitting in someone's collection, the company has mostly been lost to history. Of course, this scope mount required drilling 3 holes in the side of the receiver, which is not a favored way to treat your mil-surp today. When I took off the screws to inspect it, the scope mount and the holes themselves were filled with shavings, so it wasn't a precision installation. Additionally, the 4th screw here is where the stock ejector screw would have gone. So this rifle does not properly eject spent cases, or in my case, snap cap rounds. They get pretty buggered up. Now let's discuss why both of these rifles will never leave my collection. My grandfather's hobby was crafting stocks, including hand checkering, inlaying, end caps, and finishing up with a high gloss finish. So all this checkering you see here is his. My mother recalls him spending hours on the porch working on these firearms. As I understand it, he generally didn't do the gunsmithing. His work was focused on the stocks themselves. This is probably the original stock as provided by Santa Fe, which would be considered a nice piece of wood today for a factory stock, but it was probably commonplace for its day. He also installed a Packmeyer butt pad, which probably helped dampen the .303 British that would have been stout for such a low surface area. He also recognized a collectible when he saw one, which is why this number 5 Mark I is largely untouched. My grandfather may have been the one to install the sling swivel studs on it, but I'll certainly forgive him that sin. This Mountaineer appears to be an early example of his work, but many of his hallmark styles are visible here. The checkering pattern is consistent with many of the examples I have from him, although later examples of his work have many more custom touches. If you are lucky, I just may share them with you. I feel extremely fortunate to have this physical object to accompany my fond memories of him, and I will treasure them always. So what happened to Santa Fe and Golden State Arms? To answer that, let's take a brief detour back in time. It's post-war LA, and there are 2 crazes sweeping the nation: all things Western and military surplus weapons available for cheap. Well, the later craze may have just been among a certain demographic, but nevertheless, there was a company out there looking to capitalize on both of those crazes. The Golden State Arms Company out of Pasadena, California, had become a behemoth in the military surplus space, importing and selling leftover arms from both Axis and Allied powers. The supply was plentiful and the profits to be made were even larger. GSA could trace its roots back to a small gun store where, in 1952, a court case resulted in a new owner and a new name, Pasadena Firearms. Advertising in gun rags such as the American Rifleman in the late 1950s and early 60s brought a ton of business their way, and by 1957, a new location, a mansion in Pasadena. According to multiple reports, they embedded surplus rifles, pistols, and knives in the concrete sidewalk leading up to the front door, securing them with a clear epoxy covering. They also expanded to having a few warehouses throughout SoCal. Needless to say, they were in growth mode. Sometime around early 1960, the Santa Fe division of GSA was created. The term Santa Fe and the brand iconography capitalized on the Western themes popular during the time, despite being separated by 850 miles from its namesake city. Advertisements from Santa Fe were being seen in American Rifleman as early as May of that year for reloading supplies. By September of 1960, Santa Fe advertised gunsmith sporters, including specifically the Santa Fe Jungle Carbine for $29.95. Inflation calculators pegged that as roughly $320 in 2025 money. That product continued to feature heavily in their advertisements over the next few years. Santa Fe's use of the term Jungle Carbine as associated with a creation that had more than a passing resemblance to a Lee Enfield Rifle No. 5 Mark I cemented the term in the minds of the millions of sportsmen and collectors whose eyeballs were glued to the pages of American Rifleman magazine. You could say they were the influencers of their day. By 1966, it was all over for Santa Fe and GSA. Ownership of Golden State Arms over the years was messy, and the last owner standing had a vendor who refused to pay invoices. That might have been Sears, leaving it in a cash crunch that crippled the company and forced a bankruptcy sale. That owner died a few years later in, I kid you not, a hunting accident. Some folks familiar with the owner and the company had theorized that perhaps the owner's involvement in selling or brokering arms to unsavory characters throughout the world during a period where the Cold War was ramping up led to his demise. But the family at that time insisted all signs pointed to a simple accident. Well, that's just what they want you to think, right? So Santa Fe and Golden State Arms faded into the ether like the sun setting off the California coast. However, for the baker's dozen or so years they were in business, they had a huge impact on the mil-surp market that is still felt to this day. Well, that's all for this episode. I want to thank each and every one of you for choosing to hang out with me today, and I hope I've earned your subscription. See you next time.